Somewhere in a data center right now, a chip the size of a fingernail is making trillions of decisions a second. And every single one of them is either a 0 or a 1. No in between. No ambiguity. That is the entire foundation of the machine you are using to read or hear this sentence. And it is also, according to a growing number of physicists and neuroscientists, one of the strangest design choices in the known universe, because, as far as we can tell, nothing else that thinks actually works that way. Your brain does not compute in zeros and ones. It does not execute a fixed set of instructions in a fixed order. It runs on roughly 86 billion neurons, each one a noisy, wet, imprecise little machine, connected to thousands of others, all firing in overlapping, cascading patterns that never repeat exactly the same way twice. And yet somehow, out of that chaos, comes the experience of being you read these words, forming a thought, wondering what comes next. This gap between the clean, rigid logic of silicon and the messy, adaptive logic of a living mind is not just a curiosity for computer scientists. It sits at the center of one of the biggest open questions in modern science. What, precisely, is the difference between a system that processes information and a system that is aware of itself doing it? And if we ever do detect a signal from another intelligence somewhere out among the stars, would we even recognize it as a mind at all? Given that our best guess at what minds look like is built entirely from a sample size of one ourselves. To understand why this question is so difficult, it helps to go back nearly a century, to the moment human beings first tried to formally define what computation even means. In 1936, a young British mathematician named Alan Turing published a paper describing an imaginary device, simple mechanism that reads and writes symbols on an infinite strip of tape according to a fixed set of rules. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but Turing's insight was profound. He proved that this bare-bones device could, in principle, carry out any calculation that any computer, however complex, could ever perform. Every smartphone, every laptop, every server farm on the planet is, underneath its dazzling complexity, still fundamentally a Turing machine. A decade later, mathematician and physicist John von Neumann formalized the architecture nearly every computer still uses today: a central processor, a memory unit, and a strict, sequential flow of instructions moving between them. Around the same time, engineer and mathematician Claude Shannon, working at Bell Labs, published a paper that would become the foundation of the entire digital age, showing that information itself could be measured, transmitted, and manipulated. Using the same binary logic, mathematician George Bull had developed a century earlier to formalize human reasoning into symbolic algebra. Put those three ideas together: Turing's universal machine, von Neumann's architecture, and Shannon's mathematics of information, and you have the entire intellectual skeleton of every computer ever built. It is an extraordinary achievement. It is also, when you step back and look at it honestly, an extremely specific and narrow way of representing information as discrete, unambiguous symbols, manipulated one deterministic step at a time, a logic gate. The physical building block sitting at the bottom of this whole tower is almost embarrassingly simple. It takes an electrical signal, checks whether the voltage is high or low, and outputs a result based on a fixed rule. Combine enough of these gates together today, several billion of them on a single chip smaller than a postage stamp hand, you get a modern processor. It is an architecture built on a philosophy of certainty. Every operation is deterministic, meaning if you ran the exact same calculation 1,000,000 times, you would get the exact same answer 1,000,000 times. This is, in fact, precisely why computers are useful. You want your bank balance to be calculated the same way every single time, not subject to mood or interpretation. But this same deterministic certainty is also what makes silicon computation so different from biological cognition. A living brain is not deterministic in that same clean sense. Neurons are influenced by temperature, by blood flow, by the random jittering of ions across a membrane, by the release of neurotransmitters that vary slightly from one synapse to the next. If you could somehow rerun a single moment of human thought under identical conditions, you likely would not get an identical outcome. The brain does not treat this variability as an error to be corrected. It treats it as raw material. This is the first hint of what researchers sometimes call the binary wall, the idea that classical, rule-based computation may be structurally limited in how well it can reproduce the kind of flexible, context-sensitive reasoning that biological systems achieve almost effortlessly. It is worth pausing on what this does and does not mean. It does not mean computers cannot be powerful, or that artificial intelligence cannot produce remarkable results. Modern machine learning systems can already outperform humans at narrow tasks, from protein folding predictions to complex strategy games. What it means is something more specific. The way these systems achieve their results is fundamentally different from the way a biological brain achieves comparable results. And that difference in method may matter more than it first appears. If you want to see this gap in action, consider a task that seems trivial to any 5-year-old, recognizing your friend's face in a crowd, even if they've changed their haircut, put on sunglasses, and are standing in dim lighting 50 meters away. A modern computer vision system can be trained to do a version of this, but it requires enormous data sets, immense computing power, and it still fails in ways a human brain simply does not, confused by an unusual camera angle, a strange shadow, or a photo of a face printed on a t-shirt. The human brain performs this recognition using a tiny fraction of the wattage of a data center, updates its model instantly from a single new example, and does not need to be explicitly told what a face even is. That efficiency gap is not a matter of needing faster chips. It points at something more fundamental about how information is organized and used. It is worth noting that the field of artificial intelligence has, in fact, tried repeatedly to close this gap by borrowing directly from biology, with results that are instructive precisely because of where they succeed and where they still fall short. In 1943, neurophysiologist Warren McCulloch and logician Walter Pitts published a paper proposing a simplified mathematical model of a biological neuron, essentially a tiny unit that adds up weighted inputs and fires an output if the sum crosses a threshold. In 1958, psychologist Frank Rosenblatt built on this idea to create an early physical machine designed to learn simple pattern classification tasks by adjusting the weights of these artificial connections, and it generated genuine public excitement, with the New York Times reporting at the time that the Navy expected it might eventually be able to walk, talk, and reproduce itself. That excitement collapsed a decade later, after Marvin, Minsky, and Seymour Papert published a rigorous mathematical critique in 1969, showing that a single-layer perceptron was fundamentally incapable of solving certain simple classes of problems, contributing to a prolonged period of reduced funding and interest now remembered as the first AI winter. The field's modern resurgence depended on stacking many layers of these simplified, artificial neurons on top of each other, forming what are now called deep neural networks, combined with an efficient method called backpropagation for adjusting the connection weights across every layer at once. Refined and popularized in a 1986 paper by David Rumelhart, Geoffrey Hinton, and Ronald Williams. Even with this method available, these networks remained too slow and data-hungry to be broadly useful until two critical ingredients matured decades later: vastly larger labeled datasets made possible by the internet, and vastly more parallel computing power made possible by repurposing graphics processing units originally designed for rendering video game graphics. The turning point arrived in 2012, when a deep neural network called AlexNet, built by Alex Krzyzewski, Ilya Sutskever, and Geoffrey Hinton, dramatically outperformed every competing approach in a major image recognition competition, effectively launching the modern deep learning era. A further architectural breakthrough came in 2017, when researchers at Google published a paper introducing the transformer architecture, which allowed a network to weigh the relevance of every part of its input against every other part simultaneously, rather than processing information strictly in sequence, an approach that now underlies the large language models capable of holding fluent conversations. These systems are genuinely inspired by biology, and they are genuinely powerful, but it is worth being precise about how loose that inspiration actually is. A biological synapse is a dynamic, chemically mediated structure that can physically grow, shrink, and rewire itself continuously in response to experience, embedded in a living cell that also handles its own metabolism and repair. An artificial neural network's connection weight is a single stored number, adjusted through a mathematical optimization process that has no clear biological analog and requires, during training, computing power on a scale that dwarfs anything a biological brain uses. Training a single, large, modern language model can consume electricity on the order of what a small town might use over an extended period. A strikingly different economy of effort compared to a human brain that learns language over childhood using roughly the same 20 watts it uses for everything else. This is not a criticism of the technology, which has proven remarkable at narrow, well-defined tasks. It is a reminder that impressive output and biological-style cognition remain two genuinely separate achievements, and that closing the gap in performance on a benchmark is not the same thing as closing the gap in underlying architecture. There is, in fact, a further and more precise physical reason why this efficiency gap exists, and it goes back to a principle discovered not by a biologist but by a physicist working at IBM in the early 1960s. Rolf Landauer showed that erasing a single bit of information has an unavoidable minimum energy cost, dictated by the basic laws of thermodynamics, a result now known as Landauer's principle. Every time a conventional computer clears a memory register or resets a logic gate, it pays this tiny thermodynamic tax, and across billions of operations per second, those tiny taxes add up to the heat pouring out of every laptop fan and every data center cooling system on the planet. A biological brain, by contrast, rarely erases information in this crude, wholesale way. It reshapes existing connections gradually, strengthening some synapses and weakening others, storing new information as a modification of an existing pattern rather than a white panderywrite operation. This is one of the genuine, measurable, well-established reasons a human brain can perform enormously complex processing on roughly 20 watts of continuous power, an amount barely enough to keep a dim incandescent bulb glowing, while a machine attempting comparable tasks draws thousands of times more energy. Physicist Charles Bennett, building on Landauer's original insight in the 1970s and 80s, showed that this thermodynamic cost is not, strictly speaking, an unavoidable feature of computation itself, but specifically a consequence of irreversible operations, ones where information about a prior state is discarded and cannot be recovered. Bennett demonstrated that a computer built entirely from logically reversible operations, where every step could, in principle, be run backward to recover the exact prior state, could theoretically compute with energy dissipation approaching zero, limited only by practical friction and noise rather than any fundamental thermodynamic law. Reversible computing has remained largely a theoretical and niche, experimental pursuit rather than a mainstream engineering approach, because reversible logic circuits are considerably more complex to design and typically require preserving intermediate information that a conventional irreversible processor would simply discard, trading memory and design complexity for energy savings. It remains, nonetheless, a striking reminder that the thermodynamic inefficiency separating a laptop from a living brain is not a hard law of physics that computation must obey, but partly an engineering choice made for practical reasons of simplicity and cost, and one that biological evolution, operating under a very different and much stricter energy budget over billions of years, was never free to make in the same way. This is where the conversation naturally moves from computer science into physics specifically, into one of the most contested corners of modern biology, the question of whether quantum mechanics plays any meaningful role inside a living brain. Before going further, it is worth being honest about where the science stands, because this is a topic where speculation and established fact are frequently blurred, sometimes deliberately. The mainstream scientific position held by the majority of neuroscientists is that the brain operates through essentially classical electrochemical processes: ion channels opening and closing, neurotransmitters diffusing across synapses, electrical potentials propagating down axons. These processes are complex and only partially understood, but they do not require quantum mechanics to explain. A minority of researchers, however, have proposed that quantum effects might play a more direct role in cognition. The most well-known version of this idea comes from physicist Sir Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, who in the 1990s proposed what they called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCOR. Their hypothesis suggested that structures inside neurons, called microtubule stini, hollow protein cylinders that form part of a cell's internal skeleton, might support quantum computations that somehow give rise to conscious experience. Penrose's motivation came partly from a mathematical argument, drawing on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, that human mathematical insight cannot be fully replicated by any algorithmic process, which led him to search for a physical mechanism in the brain that could go beyond ordinary computation. This idea generated enormous public interest and equally enormous scientific skepticism. The central objection, raised repeatedly over the following decades, was about a phenomenon called decoherence. Is what happens when a delicate quantum state one, where a particle exists in a superposition of multiple possibilities at once, interacts with its noisy surrounding environment and collapses into a single, definite, classical state. It is the reason quantum computers today have to be cooled to temperatures colder than deep space and isolated from almost all outside interference, and even then can only maintain their quantum states for fractions of a second. In 2000, physicist Max Tegmark published a widely cited calculation estimating that any quantum superposition inside the brain's warm, wet environment would decohere in a timescale on the order of 10 to the negative 13 seconds, a span of time so short it seemed to rule out any possibility that such fragile states could last long enough to influence thought, which unfolds over tens or hundreds of milliseconds. The human body, by contrast, is warm, wet, and chemically chaotic, about as hostile an environment for maintaining fragile quantum coherence as you could design, if you were trying to prevent it. For years, this was considered close to a fatal blow against any theory requiring large-scale quantum effects in the brain. Then something interesting happened in an entirely different field. photosynthesis research. In 2007, a team led by Graham Fleming at the University of California, Berkeley, PUBLISHED, evidenced that certain light-harvesting proteins in green sulfur bacteria appeared to use a quantum mechanical effect to transfer energy with remarkable efficiency, even at biologically relevant temperatures. The finding suggested that evolution might have found ways to exploit quantum coherence, at least briefly and in very specific, protected molecular environments, for a genuinely functional purpose, shuttling the energy of a captured photon toward a reaction center with almost no loss. A follow-up study in 2010 by Gregory Engel and colleagues extended similar findings to marine algae, and further work suggested these coherent energy transfer pathways might persist for hundreds of femtoseconds, far longer than Tegmark's original estimate for a comparable process, though still nowhere near the timescale needed for Orko's much larger claims about consciousness itself. This research area, now broadly called quantum biology, has expanded since then to examine possible quantum effects in other biological processes too. One of the most compelling examples involves the extraordinary sense of direction some migratory birds use to detect the Earth's magnetic field. The leading hypothesis, developed by physicists Thorsten Ritz, Klaus Schulten, and their collaborators, proposes a radical pair mechanism. Light entering a bird's eye strikes a protein called cryptochrome, briefly generating a pair of electrons whose quantum spin states remain correlated or entangled even after the electrons separate within the molecule. The Earth's weak magnetic field subtly influences how these spin states evolve, and the bird's visual system may be able to translate this quantum chemical reaction into something like a visible overlay on its normal vision, allowing certain birds to see magnetic field lines. Experimental work with European robins, conducted by biologists Wolfgang and Roswitha, showed that their magnetic orientation is disrupted by extremely weak radio frequency fields tuned to a specific frequency, a result that is difficult to explain through any purely classical mechanism and lens. Real experimental weight to the quantum radical pair hypothesis. A separate and more contested strand of quantum biology involves the sense of smell. In the 1990s, biophysicist Luca Turin proposed that our nose might detect odors not purely through the traditional lock and key model, where a molecule's shape fits into a matching receptor, but partly through a quantum tunneling effect, where electrons jump across a receptor by sensing a molecule's vibrational frequency rather than only its shape. This vibration theory of olfaction remains a genuine minority position within the field, with mixed and sometimes contradictory experimental support, and most sensory biologists remain unconvinced. It is included here not because it is settled, but because it illustrates exactly how contested and unresolved the boundaries of quantum biology still are, even among specialists. This does not prove that consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon. The leap from photosynthesis may briefly exploit quantum coherence in an extremely small, cold, an isolated pocket of a protein, or a bird's eye may use entangled electron spins to sense magnetic fields. Human thought is a large-scale quantum computation happening across the whole brain is enormous, and most researchers in quantum biology are careful to say so directly. But it does mean the once confident dismissal of any quantum involvement in biology has softened considerably. The honest scientific position today is that classical neuroscience explains the overwhelming majority of what we know about how brains work, that a few specific biological processes appear to involve authentic quantum effects, and that whether consciousness itself depends on quantum mechanics, in any deeper sense, remains genuinely unresolved, and is not something current evidence can settle either way. You take a moment to sit with the sheer scale of what a single human brain accomplishes. the appeal of looking for something more exotic than plain electrochemistry becomes easier to understand. There are more potential synaptic connection patterns in a human brain than there are atoms in the observable universe. And unlike a chip design, which is fixed at the moment of manufacture, that connectivity is constantly rewriting itself in response to experience, a property called neuroplasticity that has no clean equivalent in traditional computing architecture. Every memory you form is not stored in a discrete address the way a computer stores a file. It is distributed across overlapping networks, reconstructed anew each time you recall it, subtly altered in the process. This is a strange and, from an engineering standpoint, almost inefficient way to store information. And yet it produces something no data center on Earth has managed to replicate. A system that generalizes from a handful of examples, adapts to entirely novel situations, and experiences something from the inside. That last point, experience from the inside, is the deepest and most stubborn problem in this entire discussion. And it has a name: the hard problem of consciousness. Coined by philosopher David Chalmers in the mid-1990s, the easy problems of consciousness, relatively speaking, involve explaining how the brain processes information, integrates sensory input, and produces behavior. Difficult, but in principle solvable through neuroscience. The hard problem asks something different. Why does any of that processing feel like something at all? Why isn't all of this information processing happening in the dark, with no accompanying inner experience, the way it presumably happens inside your laptop? Chalmers illustrated this with a thought experiment about a hypothetical philosophical zombie, a being physically identical to a human, behaving identically in every observable way, but with no inner experience whatsoever. If such a being is even conceivable without logical contradiction, Chalmers argued, then consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical structure and function alone. Nobody has a settled answer, and the field has produced several serious, competing frameworks rather than one accepted theory. Some researchers, like philosopher Daniel Dennett, argue that once you fully explain the mechanisms, the feeling of subjective experience is accounted for, and there is no additional mystery left over, a position often summarized, somewhat provocatively, as explaining consciousness rather than explaining it away, though critics have argued it sidesteps the hard problem rather than solving it. A very different framework, called global workspace theory, was developed by psychologist Bernard Baars in the 1980s and later refined by neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene using brain imaging evidence. This theory proposes that consciousness arises when information, processed unconsciously in parallel by many specialized brain regions, gets broadcast widely across the brain through a kind of central workspace, becoming available to memory, language, and decision-making systems all at once. Dehaene and his collaborators have found measurable neural signatures, detectable through EEG and fMRI, that appear to mark this moment of broadcast, giving global workspace theory a degree of experimental grounding that some competing theories lack. Yet another major framework, called integrated information theory, was developed by neuroscientist Giulio. Instead of asking what a system is made of, IIT asks how much information a system generates as a unified whole, above and beyond what its individual parts generate separately. Tononi represents this with a mathematical quantity he labels phi. A system with high phi is one where the whole is doing something genuinely irreducible to its components, acting independently, information integrated in a way that cannot be broken apart without losing something essential. According to this framework, a human brain, with its dense, richly interconnected architecture, should have extremely high phi. A modern computer processor, despite its staggering speed and enormous transistor count, is architected very differently. even though it contains billions of components. Most information flows through fairly modular, separable pathways, which, according to IT, would give it comparatively low phi, regardless of how fast or capable it appears from the outside. This is a genuinely important idea, but it is important to be precise about what kind of claim it is. Integrated information theory is a serious, actively researched, and also actively contested scientific hypothesis about consciousness, an experimentally confirmed fact, and not a magic formula that draws a hard, universally agreed upon line separating conscious systems from unconscious ones. Calculating phi for a real, complex system like an actual human brain is currently far beyond our computational reach, and several prominent researchers have raised substantive objections to the theory's core assumptions. In 2023, a group of scientists went so far as to publicly label IT pseudoscience in a widely discussed open letter, arguing that some of its claims are currently untestable. A strong reaction that itself became a notable moment in the ongoing scientific debate, and one that Tononi and his collaborators pushed back on. What IT offers is not a settled verdict, but one of the more mathematically rigorous attempts anyone has made to even ask the question in a way that could, in principle, someday be tested. Still another approach, gaining considerable influence over the past decade, comes from neuroscientist Carl Friston, whose free energy principle and predictive processing framework suggest that the brain is not primarily a passive receiver of sensory information at all, but an active prediction engine. On this view, the brain constantly generates a model of what it expects to sense next, compares that prediction against incoming sensory signals, and updates its internal model to minimize the resulting error, what Friston calls free energy in a formal, information theoretic sense borrowed from statistical physics. Perception, on this account, is less like a camera passively recording the world and more like a controlled hallucination, continuously corrected by reality. This framework does not directly claim to solve the hard problem of consciousness, but it has reshaped how many neuroscientists think about the basic computational strategy the brain uses, and it stands in fairly sharp contrast to the simple, linear input-output logic of a conventional computer program. There is also an older and stranger position worth mentioning honestly, precisely because it periodically resurfaces in popular science discussions. Panpsychism, the idea, with roots stretching back to certain strands of ancient philosophy and defended today by philosophers including Philip Goff, that consciousness in some extremely minimal form might be a fundamental feature of matter itself, present in some rudimentary way even at the level of subatomic particles, rather than something that only switches on once matter becomes sufficiently complex. This is not a mainstream position within neuroscience, and it faces serious philosophical objections, most notably what is called the combination problem, the difficulty of explaining how countless minimal, particle-level fragments of experience could combine into a single, unified consciousness like the one you are using right now. It is worth mentioning here not because it is well supported, but because it illustrates how genuinely unresolved the deepest questions about consciousness remain, even at the level of basic philosophical framing, let alone experimental confirmation. A striking piece of experimental evidence bearing directly on this question of unity comes from a body of research conducted in the 1960s and beyond by neuropsychologists Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, studying patients who had undergone a surgical procedure called a corpus callosotomy, severing the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the brains to hemispheres, typically performed at the time as a last resort treatment for severe, otherwise uncontrollable epilepsy. In carefully controlled experiments, Gazzaniga and Sperry found that once this connection was severed, Each hemisphere could be shown to process information and even make simple decisions independently of the other, sometimes producing behavior that looked under precise laboratory conditions, remarkably like two separate streams of awareness operating within a single skull, each unaware of certain information available only to the other side. Sperry received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1981 largely for this body of work. The interpretation of exactly what these split-brain patients experience subjectively, whether truly two separate centers of awareness or one unified experience with unusual gaps in cross-communication, remains debated among philosophers and neuroscientists, and Gazzaniga himself was notably cautious about overstating the case for full duality of consciousness. But at minimum, the research demonstrates something that unsettles a comfortable, intuitive assumption most people carry into this whole conversation, that a single brain necessarily produces a single, indivisible stream of consciousness. If that assumption can fracture under specific, well-documented surgical conditions in an ordinary human brain, it becomes considerably harder to assume with confidence what form of unity, if any, a fundamentally different kind of cognitive architecture, biological or artificial, terrestrial or otherwise, would necessarily possess. And running underneath nearly all of these debates is a much older challenge, posed by philosopher John Searle in 1980 through a thought experiment called the Chinese Room. Imagine a person who does not understand Chinese, sitting inside a sealed room, receiving Chinese symbols through a slot, consulting an enormous rulebook to determine which symbols to send back out, and producing responses so fluent that anyone outside the room would swear they were talking to a native speaker. Searle's argument was that this person, and by extension, any computer running any program, however sophisticated, could produce all the right outputs without understanding anything at all. The thought experiment was aimed squarely at an earlier, highly influential idea from Alan Turing himself, the Turing test, proposed in 1950, which suggested that if a machine's conversation became indistinguishable from a human's, we would have no principled grounds left to deny it was thinking. More than 70 years later, with modern language models producing conversation fluent enough to pass informal versions of exactly this test, the Chinese room argument has taken on new relevance, and the debate it sparked between who argue that the right kind of information processing simply is understanding, and their critics, who argue that behavior alone can never guarantee genuine inner experience, remains entirely unresolved. One promising development, worth mentioning because it represents a genuine attempt to move this entire discussion from pure philosophy toward something empirically testable, comes from neuroscientist Marcello Massimini and his collaborators, who developed a measure called the Perturbational Complexity Index in the early 2010s. The method works by using a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation to send a brief, precisely targeted magnetic pulse into the brain, then recording the resulting cascade of electrical activity across the scalp using EEG in a fully conscious, awake brain. This initial pulse triggers a complex, widespread, and highly differentiated pattern of activity, rippling across many distinct brain regions in a structured but non-repeating way. In a brain that is in deep sleep under general anesthesia, or in certain disorders of consciousness following severe brain injury, the same pulse instead triggers a much simpler, more uniform, or more localized response. Massimini's team showed that the resulting complexity score, calculated using algorithmic compression methods borrowed from information theory, correlates strongly and reliably with independent clinical assessments of a patient's level of consciousness, including in genuinely difficult diagnostic cases such as patients in a minimally conscious state following brain injury, where standard behavioral tests can be unreliable. This does not resolve the philosophical hard problem, and it does not directly measure integrated information in the full mathematical sense Tonani's theory describes, but it represents a rare, working, clinically validated bridge between abstract theories of consciousness and something a physician can actually measure at a patient's bedside. And it has already begun to influence real medical decisions about patients in intensive care who cannot otherwise communicate whether anyone is home. It's worth pausing here, because this is exactly the kind of open, unresolved question that rewards curiosity rather than certainty, the kind of thing worth sitting with, turning over, maybe even digging into further after you finish watching this. Whether that means reading Chalmers' original papers on the hard problem, Tonani's writing on integrated information, or simply following where your own questions lead, before turning outward toward the search for minds beyond Earth. It is worth asking a more grounded question first. Are there already forms of intelligence, right here on this planet, that think in ways genuinely alien to our own? Not from another world, but simply from a radically different evolutionary lineage? The answer, it turns out, is almost certainly yes. And looking at them closely gives us a far more honest sense of what non-human cognition might actually mean than pure speculation about extraterrestrial minds ever could. Consider the octopus. An octopus possesses roughly 500 million neurons, a number in the same rough order of magnitude as a dog, but distributed in a way utterly unlike any vertebrate brain. Only around a third of those neurons sit in the animal's central brain. The remaining 2/3 are distributed throughout its 8 arms, each one containing a substantial, semi-autonomous cluster of neurons capable of processing sensory information and coordinating movement with a striking degree of independence from central command. Researchers, including neurobiologist Binyo, have shown that a severed octopus arm can continue to execute complex, coordinated reaching and grasping movements for a period of time, even after being separated from the animal's central brain entirely. This is not remotely how vertebrate nervous systems are organized, where the brain acts as an undisputed central executive. It raises a genuinely strange question that echoes far beyond marine biology. If cognition can be this distributed, this decentralized, in a creature evolving on the very same planet as us, under the very same laws of physics and chemistry, how much more radically different might cognition become on a world where evolution followed an entirely separate trajectory for billions of years? Plants offer an even stranger case, precisely because they possess no neurons and no brain at all, and yet demonstrably process information, communicate, and, in a limited but measurable sense, adapt their behavior. Research led by biologist Monica Gogliano has shown that certain plants, including the sensitive plant Mimosa puta, can exhibit a simple form of learned behavior, becoming habituated to a harmless, repeated stimulus and stopping their defensive, leaf-folding response over time, then retaining that learned response for weeks afterward, a finding that remains genuinely debated within plant biology, but one that has prompted serious researchers to reconsider how narrowly the concept of learning should be defined. Beneath the forest floor, mycorrhizal fungal networks connect the root systems of separate trees, sometimes across an entire forest, allowing them to exchange nutrients, chemical signals, and even distress warnings about insect attacks. A phenomenon popularly nicknamed the Wood Wide Web, following research led by forest ecologist Suzanne Simard. None of this constitutes consciousness in any sense comparable to a human's, and serious plant scientists are careful to avoid overstating the comparison. But it demonstrates, with hard evidence rather than speculation, that meaningful information processing, memory, and coordinated response to the environment do not require a centralized brain or even neurons at all. A third and equally striking example comes from swarm intelligence, complex, adaptive, seemingly purposeful behavior that emerges not from any single controlling mind, but from the interaction of many simple individual agents following comparatively basic local rules. A colony of ants can solve surprisingly sophisticated logistics problems, finding efficient paths between a nest and a food source, allocating labor between foraging and nest maintenance, even adjusting collective behavior in response to changing conditions, despite no individual ant having anything resembling a plan or a model of the colony as a whole. Each ant is simply responding to local chemical signals called pheromones left by other ants. Starling murmurations, those breathtaking, fluid, shape-shifting clouds of thousands of birds moving as one, arise from each individual bird tracking only a handful of its nearest neighbors, following simple rules about matching speed and avoiding collision, with no leader coordinating the group at all. Perhaps strangest of all is Physerum polycephalum, a single-celled slime mold with no nervous system whatsoever, which researchers, including Toshiyuki Nakagaki, have shown is capable of solving maze navigation problems and even approximating efficient transportation network designs. In one famous 2010 experiment reconstructing a structure closely resembling the layout of the Tokyo rail system when food sources were placed at the positions of major cities. These are not conscious systems by any serious scientific definition, but they are proof that intelligence, in the broad sense of adaptive, information-driven, goal-directed behavior, can take radically different physical forms than a centralized, neuron-based brain, which matters enormously the moment the conversation turns to intelligence that might have evolved somewhere else entirely. A fourth example, and perhaps the one that most directly challenges the assumption that intelligence requires a large, mammalian-style brain, comes from birds. Crows, ravens, and other corvids possess brains roughly the size of a walnut, weighing only a few grams, and yet display cognitive abilities that rival or, in some specific tasks, exceed those of great apes. Research, led by comparative psychologist Nathan Emery and others, has documented new Caledonian crows manufacturing and using tools in the wild, bending wire into hooks to extract food from narrow crevices, a behavior that requires understanding cause and effect well enough to modify an object toward a future goal rather than simply reacting to the present moment. Experiments have also shown these birds can plan several steps ahead, solving multi-stage puzzle boxes that require completing an earlier seemingly unrewarded step before a later reward becomes accessible. For decades, comparative neuroscientists assumed that sophisticated cognition required something like a mammalian cortex, the layered outer structure of the human brain long associated with higher reasoning. A study published in 2020 by neuroscientist Andreas Nieder and colleagues found that neurons in a crow's brain show patterns consistent with sensory consciousness, a subjective awareness of a stimulus, using an entirely different neural architecture than the mammalian cortex, called the pallium, that evolved along a completely separate lineage stretching back more than 300 million years to the last common ancestor of birds and mammals. In other words, sophisticated cognition appears to have evolved independently from a different starting architecture, at least twice on this single planet. Cetaceans offer yet another variation. Sperm whales and dolphins possess brains larger than a human's in absolute terms, organized around a different balance of specialized regions, and communicate using complex, structured vocalizations that researchers are only beginning to systematically decode. The Cetacean Translation Initiative, known as Project SETI, launched in 2020 and combining machine learning with underwater recording arrays, has begun mapping the structure of sperm whale click sequences finding evidence of what researchers describe as a combinatorial system. Smaller building blocks of sound arranged and varied in ways that carry distinct information, echoing some structural features of human language without being human language itself. Elephants, operating on yet another separate evolutionary branch, have demonstrated mirror self-recognition, cooperative problem-solving that requires understanding a partner's role in a shared task, and behavior widely interpreted by researchers, including elephant cognition specialist Joyce Poole, as a form of grief, including returning repeatedly to the remains of deceased herd members. None of these species think the way humans do, and serious researchers resist the temptation to simply project human categories onto them. But together, crows, cetaceans, elephants, octopuses, and the various swarm and plant systems already discussed make a strong, evidence-based case for something important. Intelligence is not a single evolutionary event that happened once. It is a solution that evolution appears to have found repeatedly, through different routes, using different materials, arriving at genuinely different cognitive architectures each time. This accumulating weight of evidence across so many separate species reached a notable formal milestone in July of 2012, when a group of prominent neuroscientists gathered at the University of Cambridge signed what became known as the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, publicly stating that the weight of scientific evidence indicates that a wide range of non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, possess the neurological substrates capable of generating conscious experience and intentional behavior, and that humans are not unique in possessing these capacities. The declaration was signed in the presence of physicist Stephen Hawking and represented a significant, if informal, consensus statement from within the neuroscience community. Though it is worth noting, it was a declaration of scientific judgment based on existing evidence, rather than a new experimental finding in itself. And some researchers continue to debate exactly how far down the tree of life measurable consciousness plausibly extends. That fact alone should recalibrate expectations about what a mind that evolved on an entirely different planet, under an entirely different chemistry, might actually look like, which brings the documentary, appropriately, out past the atmosphere and into the search for minds beyond our own world. For more than 60 years, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence has operated almost entirely within a framework built around radio astronomy. The logic, first formalized in a landmark 1959 paper by physicists Giuseppe Coccone and Philip Morrison, was elegantly practical. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, require relatively little energy to transmit across interstellar distances compared to other methods, and pass largely unimpeded through interstellar gas and dust. If another civilization wanted to be found, or if we simply wanted to detect the accidental radio leakage of a technological society, listening across specific radio frequencies seemed like the most promising approach available with the technology of the time. The following year, in 1960, astronomer Frank Drake conducted the very first modern SETI search, called Project Ozma, pointing the 85-foot radio telescope at Green Bank Observatory toward to nearby sun-like stars for several weeks. It found nothing, but it established the basic methodology that has continued, in increasingly sophisticated forms, ever since. Drake is also responsible for one of the most famous frameworks in the entire field, the Drake equation. First written down in 1961 as an agenda for a small scientific meeting rather than a serious predictive formula, it estimates the number of currently active, communicating civilizations in our galaxy by multiplying together a chain of factors: the average rate of star formation, the fraction of those stars that host planets, the average number of planets per system capable of supporting life, the fraction of those that actually develop life, the fraction of that life that develops intelligence, the fraction of intelligent life that develops detectable technology, and finally, the average length of time such a civilization continues broadcasting detectable signals before falling silent, whether through extinction, self-destruction, or simply switching to communication methods we cannot detect. The honest scientific value of the Drake equation is not that it produces a reliable number, since several of its terms remain almost entirely unconstrained by any actual data, but that it cleanly organizes an otherwise overwhelming question into a series of smaller, more tractable ones, several of which modern astronomy has genuinely begun to answer. The planet-related terms, in particular, have shifted dramatically since Drake's original 1961 estimate. For most of the 20th century, humanity did not know with any certainty whether planets existed around other stars at all. That changed in 1995, when astronomers Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz detected 51 Pegasi b, the first confirmed exoplanet orbiting a Sun-like star, a discovery that earned them the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2019. Since then, NASA's Kepler Space Telescope, launched in 2009, and its successor missions have confirmed the existence of more than 5,000 exoplanets, with statistical analysis of Kepler's survey data suggesting that our galaxy likely contains tens of billions of roughly Earth-sized planets, orbiting within their star's habitable zone. The range of orbital distances where liquid water could plausibly exist on a planet's surface. The uncertainty in the Drake equation has not disappeared, but it has migrated. We now have real data on how common, potentially habitable planets are, and the remaining, deeply unresolved questions are almost entirely biological and sociological rather than astronomical, concerning how often life actually begins, how often it becomes complex, how often it becomes intelligent, and how long a technological civilization tends to survive. This shift in emphasis connects directly to one of the most famous open questions in all of science, posed almost as an offhand remark by physicist Enrico Fermi during a 1950 lunchtime conversation at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Given the sheer number of stars in our galaxy, the vast span of time, more than 13 billion years, during which life could have arisen and technological civilizations could have had time to spread, and the relatively modest engineering required, in principle, to colonize a galaxy over a few million years using self-replicating probes. Fermi's question was disarmingly simple: where is everybody? This apparent contradiction between the statistical likelihood that intelligent life should be common and abundant, and the total absence of any confirmed evidence for it anywhere, is now known as the Fermi paradox, and it has generated one of the richest bodies of serious scientific and philosophical speculation in modern astronomy. Proposed resolutions to the Fermi paradox span an enormous range. Some researchers argue for what is called the Great Filter hypothesis, the idea that at least one step along the path from simple chemistry to a galaxy-spanning civilization is extraordinarily improbable, acting as a bottleneck that filters out nearly every potential civilization before it can become detectable. And the deeply important, unresolved question is whether that filter lies behind us, meaning something like the origin of life itself is the rare, lucky event, or whether it lies ahead of us, meaning technological civilizations reliably destroy themselves or collapse before they can spread beyond their homeworld, a considerably less comforting possibility. Part of what makes Fermi's original question so sharp is a specific engineering argument formalized decades later, building on ideas John von Neumann had explored about machines capable of constructing copies of themselves. If even a single civilization developed the capacity to build self-replicating probes, machines capable of traveling to a nearby star system, using locally available raw materials to construct additional copies of themselves, and then dispatching those copies onward to further systems. The mathematics of exponential growth suggest such a wave of probes could, in principle, traverse and survey an entire galaxy comparable in size to our own within a time span on the order of a few million to a few tens of millions of years. A genuinely brief interval on the scale of our galaxy's more than 13 billion year history. This specific version of the paradox, sometimes discussed under the framework of von Neumann probes, sharpens Fermi's original question considerably. It suggests that even a single technological civilization, arising just once, anywhere, at almost any point over billions of years of galactic history, and surviving long enough to develop this comparatively modest level of automated space engineering, should already have been sufficient to fill the galaxy with detectable evidence of its activity, making the total absence of any such evidence today even more striking than the raw improbability of intelligent life arising in the first place. Other proposed explanations include the zoo hypothesis, suggesting advanced civilizations may deliberately avoid contact for reasons we cannot anticipate. The possibility that interstellar travel and communication are simply far harder and more resource-intensive than early 20th century optimism assumed, or the straightforward possibility that we have not yet searched nearly long enough, closely enough, or in the right ways to have found anything, given that current, meaningful SETI observations cover only a vanishingly small fraction of the galaxies, stars, and an even smaller fraction of possible signal types and frequencies. Part of what makes the Fermi paradox so persistently difficult to resolve is just how severe the physical barriers to interstellar travel and communication actually are. Barriers that are frequently underestimated in popular discussion. Even light, the fastest thing in the universe, takes more than 4 years just to reach our nearest stellar neighbor, Proxima Centauri, and tens of thousands of years to cross the width of our galaxy. Conventional chemical rocket propulsion, the only method humanity has ever actually used to leave Earth, is spectacularly inefficient for distances beyond our own solar system. The Voyager 1 spacecraft, humanity's most distant human-made object and currently traveling faster relative to the Sun than any other operational probe, would still take roughly 70,000 years to reach the distance of Proxima Centauri if it were even aimed in that direction, which it is not. This is precisely why the Breakthrough Starshot initiative, announced in 2016 alongside Breakthrough Listen, proposed an entirely different approach, accelerating a fleet of extremely lightweight probes, each attached to a thin sail only a few meters across, using a ground-based array of lasers delivering an intense, sustained push of light pressure, with the theoretical goal of reaching roughly 20% of the speed of light, fast enough to reach Proxima Centauri in a bit over 20 years rather than tens of millennia. The concept remains firmly in early feasibility research, with substantial unsolved engineering challenges around beam stability, sail material science, and how such a probe could transmit any data back once it arrived. But it illustrates how seriously some physicists now take the idea that interstellar distances, while daunting, may not be permanently insurmountable. Given sufficiently patient and creative engineering, this physical difficulty has also produced its own contribution to Fermi paradox speculation, popularized well beyond academic circles by the science fiction author Liu Cixin, the dark forest hypothesis, which proposes that advanced civilizations might have strong strategic incentives to remain silent and hidden rather than announce their presence, on the theory that any other civilization encountered would be forced, out of basic survival logic under conditions of uncertainty, to treat an unknown newcomer as a potential threat to be eliminated before it could become one itself. It is important to be clear that this is a philosophical and game-theoretic thought experiment, drawn partly from international relations theory, not a scientific hypothesis with any observational support, and many researchers in the SETI field find it unpersuasive as a general explanation, since it requires assuming a fairly specific and pessimistic form of rational, strategic behavior across every possible civilization everywhere. It is included here because it has become one of the more widely discussed proposed resolutions to the Fermi paradox in recent years, and because, true or not, it is a useful illustration of just how wide the space of serious, informed speculation on this question has become, precisely because the actual data remains so limited. This raises an uncomfortable but important possibility that serious SETI researchers openly discuss. What if we have been listening in the wrong way entirely? Not because radio waves are a poor communication method in principle, but because our search strategy assumes that another intelligence would choose to communicate using methods and frequencies convenient for human engineering in the 20th century. Modern SETI research has expanded well beyond simple radio listening in response to exactly this concern. The SETI Institute in California continues large-scale radio surveys today, alongside newer efforts focused on optical SETI, scanning for brief, powerful laser pulses that a distant civilization might use for interstellar signaling, a method that some researchers argue could be more energy efficient over long distances than broadcasting continuous radio waves. The Breakthrough Listen initiative, launched in 2015 with backing from the late investor Yuri Milner and endorsed publicly by physicist Stephen Hawking, represents the most comprehensive search of its kind ever conducted, scanning millions of star systems across a broad range of radio and optical frequencies, using powerful telescopes including the Green Bank Telescope in West Virginia and the Parkes Observatory in Australia. The search has also expanded conceptually, beyond deliberate communication altogether, toward what astronomers now call technosignatures, any detectable sign of technology, whether or not it was ever intended as a message. This includes searching the atmospheres of distant exoplanets, using instruments like the James Webb Space Telescope for chemical signatures that would be difficult to explain without industrial activity, such as certain synthetic gases that have no known natural source. It includes the more speculative, but scientifically serious, search for partial or full Dyson spheres, enormous megastructures theoretically capable of capturing a significant fraction of a star's total energy output, an idea formalized by physicist Freeman Dyson in 1960 and connected to a broader framework called the Kardashev scale, proposed by Soviet astronomer Nikolai Kardashev in 1964, which classifies hypothetical civilizations by the total scale of energy they are able to harness. A Type 1 civilization using roughly all the energy available on its home planet, a Type 2 capturing the entire energy output of its parent star, and a Type 3 harnessing the energy of an entire galaxy. By this scale, current human civilization sits well below Type 1, harnessing only a small fraction of the energy reaching Earth from the Sun. Alongside listening, humanity has also, on a small number of occasions, deliberately broadcast. In 1974, scientists, including Frank Drake, used the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico, then the largest single-dish telescope on Earth, to transmit a structured, encoded radio message toward the globular star cluster M13, roughly 25,000 light-years away, containing basic information about human biology, our solar system, and the structure of DNA rendered as a simple bitmap image. Because of the immense distance involved, the message will not arrive for another 25,000 years. and it was understood at the time to be a largely symbolic gesture, more a demonstration of the technology and an inspiring statement about human curiosity than a serious attempt at establishing contact. It has nonetheless remained a touchstone for an ongoing and genuinely contentious debate within the scientific community, sometimes called the METI debate, short for Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence, over whether humanity should be actively transmitting signals about our location and existence at all, as opposed to only listening. Prominent voices, including astronomer and science fiction author David Brin and physicist Stephen Hawking, have urged caution, arguing that broadcasting our presence to an unknown and potentially unfriendly civilization before we know anything about it carries risks that are difficult to evaluate and potentially irreversible. Others, including Russian astronomer Alexander Zaitsev, who conducted several additional deliberate transmissions in the years since Arecibo, have argued that a sufficiently advanced civilization capable of reaching us would already be capable of detecting our accidental radio and radar leakage regardless of whether we deliberately transmit, making the additional risk from intentional messages effectively negligible. This disagreement has never been formally resolved, and it remains an active area of ethical debate within the SETI research community. Rather than a settled question with an agreed answer, the search for biosignatures, meanwhile, has become considerably more rigorous and technically demanding than early proposals suggested. The core challenge is that most individual gases detected in a distant planet's atmosphere could plausibly be produced by either biological or purely geological processes. So, researchers increasingly focus on chemical disequilibrium, looking for combinations of gases that would not be expected to coexist stably without something, whether living or not, continuously replenishing them. Oxygen alongside methane is considered a particularly promising combination, since oxygen is highly reactive and would normally break methane down fairly quickly through purely atmospheric chemistry. So their sustained coexistence in significant quantities could suggest ongoing biological production of one or both gases, roughly analogous to how Earth's own atmosphere is kept in a similar, life-sustained disequilibrium. This approach faced a highly public test in 2020, when a research team led by astronomer Jane Greaves reported a possible detection of phosphine gas in the atmosphere of Venus, a molecule that on Earth is strongly associated with biological processes, generating enormous media attention and speculation about microbial life in the planet's cloud layer. The finding was quickly and vigorously contested by multiple independent research groups, who raised significant concerns about the original data processing and were unable to consistently reproduce the detection in follow-up observations. And the current scientific consensus is that the original phosphine detection remains unconfirmed and quite possibly a data processing artifact rather than a genuine atmospheric signal. The episode has become something of a case study in the field for how quickly a genuinely exciting, carefully qualified scientific result can be amplified into something that sounds far more definitive than the underlying data actually supported. And it has pushed astrobiologists toward demanding even stronger, multiply confirmed evidence before treating any biosignature claim as credible. As of now, none of these efforts, deliberate transmission, passive listening, or atmospheric biosignature detection, have produced a confirmed detection of an artificial signal or technosignature from beyond our solar system. There have been intriguing anomalies over the decades. The famous WOW signal, a brief, unusually strong narrowband radio signal detected on August 15, 1977 by astronomer Jerry Eman using the Big Ear radio telescope in Ohio, remains unexplained and was never detected again despite repeated follow-up observations. More recently, the interstellar object, first detected passing through our solar system in 2017, generated significant public speculation about an artificial origin after its unusual elongated shape and unexpected acceleration were observed. Though the overwhelming consensus among astronomers, including the teams that tracked it most closely, is that natural explanations involving outgassing of frozen material remain far more likely and consistent with the evidence, even though some details of its behavior remain only partially explained. Unexplained and confirmed extraterrestrial signal or artifact are very different categories, and researchers are careful to keep them separate. However tempting the alternative might be, this is where the honest, speculative edge of the field lives, and it deserves to be treated as exactly that: open, informed speculation, not settled science dressed up as discovery. There is no confirmed data from any year showing coherence patterns in deep space signals that indicate non-human cognition. There is no detected quantum handshake from another civilization, and no serious observational program currently searching for one, because current physics gives us no established mechanism by which such a thing could even work. What we can honestly say is this: some physicists have explored, at a theoretical level, whether quantum entanglement could ever be exploited for a form of communication, and the current, well-established answer from quantum mechanics itself is that entanglement cannot be used to transmit information faster than light or to send a controllable signal at all. A result formalized as the no-communication theorem, proven rigorously within standard quantum theory. This doesn't rule out quantum mechanics being relevant to future technology in other ways, including genuinely revolutionary applications like quantum cryptography and quantum computing. But it does close off the more dramatic version of instantaneous quantum communication that occasionally appears in popular science writing. It is also worth mentioning, briefly and honestly, an entirely different and still more speculative idea connected to the origin of life rather than its communication: panspermia. The hypothesis that the basic chemical building blocks of life, or even simple, hardy microorganisms, might be capable of surviving transport between planets or even star systems, embedded in comets, asteroids, or interstellar dust, potentially seeding life across multiple worlds, rather than life needing to originate independently everywhere it appears. This idea gained some genuine scientific traction after the discovery of organisms found thriving on Earth in conditions once thought completely incompatible with life, in boiling acidic hot springs, in the crushing pressure and darkness of deep ocean hydrothermal vents, encased in ancient polar ice, and even in the case of a remarkably tough microscopic animal called the tardigrade, surviving direct exposure to the vacuum and radiation of outer space during controlled experiments conducted on the European Space Agency's Photon M3 mission in 2007. These discoveries have not proven panspermia correct, but they have substantially expanded scientists' sense of how resilient life can be, and by extension, how many different kinds of environments across the galaxy might be capable of hosting it. What we're left with, instead of a clean answer, is a genuinely fascinating open frontier, and arguably a more interesting one than a tidy discovery would be. If intelligence can emerge from carbon-based neurons running on roughly 20 watts of metabolic power, shaped by billions of years of evolutionary pressure on Earth specifically, then it seems almost naive to assume that intelligence arising under entirely different evolutionary pressures, on a world with a different chemistry, different physics of its local environment, and an entirely separate evolutionary history, would necessarily organize its cognition the way ours does. Human logic, including the classical logic underlying our computers, emerged from a very particular evolutionary context: a need to track objects moving through three-dimensional space. to model the intentions of other social primates, to plan sequences of actions toward survival and reproduction. Boolean, algebra, symbolic language, and step-by-step reasoning are powerful tools that emerged from this specific evolutionary and cultural history, not necessarily a universal blueprint that any sufficiently intelligent system must converge on. This is precisely why some researchers in the study of astrobiology and the philosophy of mind have started asking a different kind of question. Instead of what would an alien signal sound like, they ask what would alien cognition even look like, structurally, if it emerged from a completely different substrate. Some theoretical proposals imagine cognition organized around principles other than sequential, symbolic reasoning, systems where information is represented in massively parallel, continuously varying patterns rather than discrete steps, closer in spirit to how a flock of starlings coordinates its movement as a single fluid shape, or how an octopus's arms process sensory information semi-independently of its central brain, than to how a computer program executes a line of code. These remained thought experiments and theoretical proposals, useful for expanding our imagination about what intelligence could be, not descriptions of anything we have observed or detected beyond Earth. If any of this has you genuinely curious about how these fields fit together, it's worth spending some time with primary sources rather than second-hand summaries, reading Drake's original framing of his equation, or Chalmers' early papers on the hard problem, or simply following NASA and CETA Institute public updates as new exoplanet and technosignature data continues to come in. This is one of the rare areas of science where a motivated amateur with no formal training can genuinely follow the primary research as it unfolds in close to real time. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the actual verifiable frontier of computing research has been moving in a direction that at least gestures towards some of these same underlying questions, even without any reference to extraterrestrial life. Quantum computing, built around genuine, well-established physics rather than speculation, exploits real quantum phenomena, superposition and entanglement, to perform certain classes of calculation that would be effectively impossible for classical computers, where a classical bit must be either a 0 or a 1, a quantum bit or qubit can exist in a superposition of both states simultaneously, and when multiple qubits become entangled with one another, the resulting system can represent and manipulate an exponentially larger space of possibilities than an equivalent number of classical bits ever could. Companies including IBM, Google, and a growing number of specialized quantum computing startups have built functioning quantum processors, and in 2019, Google announced that its Sycamore processor had achieved what it called quantum supremacy, completing a specific, narrowly defined calculation in about 200 seconds that Google estimated would take the best available classical supercomputer roughly 10,000 years, a claim that generated real scientific debate, particularly from IBM researchers who argued the classical comparison was somewhat unfair and that a well-optimized classical approach could perform the same task in a matter of days rather than millennia, but which nonetheless marked a genuine, widely acknowledged milestone in demonstrating quantum computational advantage under real experimental conditions. The single largest engineering obstacle in quantum computing remains the same fragility problem this documentary has already encountered inside the brain. Qubits are exceptionally sensitive to any interaction with their surrounding environment, and maintaining a useful quantum state requires extreme isolation, often including cooling to temperatures colder than the depths of interstellar space, just a fraction of a degree above absolute zero. This is why building a quantum computer that can reliably outperform classical machines on a wide range of practical problems, rather than one narrow, specially designed benchmark, has proven so difficult. Significant recent progress has come from quantum error correction, a set of techniques that encode a single, more stable logical qubit across many physical qubits, allowing the system to detect and correct errors introduced by environmental noise without directly measuring, and thereby destroying the fragile quantum state itself. In December of 2023, Google reported a milestone in this area, demonstrating for the first time that increasing the number of physical qubits used per logical qubit could measurably reduce the overall error rate, a long-sought threshold that many researchers consider essential before large-scale, practically useful quantum computers become possible. Separately, Microsoft and other research groups have pursued an alternative approach entirely, based on a still experimental class of particle called a Majorana quasi, hoping to build what are called topological qubits, which would be inherently more resistant to environmental noise by virtue of how information is physically encoded within them. Though this approach remains considerably earlier in its development, and has been the subject of its own scientific controversies over interpretation of experimental results. Separately, and just as significant for this conversation, neuromorphic computing has emerged as an entirely different attempt to close the gap between silicon and biological cognition, this time without invoking quantum mechanics at all. Neuromorphic chips, including IBM's introduced in 2014, and Intel's Loihi processors, first introduced in 2017, with a significantly more advanced second generation released in 2021, are designed to physically mimic the architecture of biological neurons and synapses, rather than the traditional logic gate structure of conventional processors. Instead of a rigid, clock-driven sequence of operations, these chips use spiking neural networks, where information is encoded in the timing and pattern of discrete electrical pulses, much closer to how a biological neuron actually communicates. Intel has reported that Loihi-based systems can perform certain specific pattern recognition and sensory tasks using roughly 1,000 times less energy than an equivalent task run on a conventional processor, precisely because these architectures are borrowing design principles from biology rather than from Boolean logic, activating only the specific portions of the chip actually needed for a given computation at a given moment, much as a biological brain does not fire every neuron for every task. A third and more literal attempt to bridge silicon and biological cognition is happening not in the abstract, through architecture inspired by the brain, but through direct physical connection to it. Brain-computer interfaces aim to create a working link between neural tissue and an external electronic system, and the field has progressed considerably from its origins in laboratory research with animals in the late 20th century. In 2004, neuroscientist John Donahue and colleagues implanted the BrainGate system in a paralyzed human patient, allowing him to control a computer cursor using signals recorded directly from his motor cortex, demonstrating for the first time that a human brain's electrical activity could be reliably decoded and translated into control of an external device in real time. Since then, the field has advanced considerably. Neuralink, founded in 2016, has developed an implant using thousands of flexible electrode threads and, in 2023, received approval to begin human clinical trials, with early participants able to control a computer cursor and play simple video games using neural signals alone. A separate company, Synchron, has pursued a less invasive approach, threading a stent-like electrode array into the brain through the blood vessels rather than requiring open skull surgery, and reported similar functional results in its own early human trials. These systems remain, for now, fundamentally translation devices rather than any kind of merger between biological and silicon cognition. They read a comparatively narrow band of electrical activity, primarily from the motor cortex, and use conventional machine learning algorithms running on entirely ordinary silicon hardware to decode that activity into intended movements or commands. The brain itself is not computing any differently than it would without the implant, and the implanted electronics are not participating in cognition in any meaningful sense. They are simply eavesdropping on a small slice of the brain's ordinary electrical activity and translating it. This entire line of inquiry connects to a broader philosophical proposal that predates any of these specific implants, the extended mind thesis, put forward in a highly influential 1998 paper by philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers, the same Chalmers behind the hard problem of consciousness. Clark and Chalmers argued that cognition does not necessarily stop at the boundary of the skull, and that external tools, reliably and continuously integrated into a person's thinking process, can become genuine functional components of that person's mind rather than merely aids to it. Their central illustrative example involved a hypothetical man with memory impairment, who relies on a notebook to record and later retrieve information, functioning so consistently and automatically that the notebook, they argued, plays the same cognitive role his biological memory would otherwise play, making it philosophically reasonable to describe it as part of his mind rather than simply a tool his mind uses. Applied to the present day, this argument suggests that a smartphone functioning as constantly accessed external memory, or a search engine functioning as instantly accessible external knowledge, may already represent a real, if modest, blurring of the line between biological cognition and external computation, long before anything as dramatic as a direct neural implant enters the picture. The thesis remains philosophically contested, with critics arguing it stretches the definition of mind past its useful meaning, but it offers a genuinely useful lens for this documentary's central question, suggesting that the boundary between biological and silicon-based cognition may never have been quite as sharp or fixed as the opening image of a rigid, binary chip contrasted against a fluid, biological brain first suggested. Still, the trajectory of brain-computer interface research is worth noting, honestly, because it represents the most direct, physically grounded version of the philosophical question this documentary has been circling from the start. If it eventually becomes possible to read from and eventually write meaningful information back into much larger and more diverse regions of the brain, the sharp conceptual line between biological cognition and computational assistance may become considerably blurrier than it is today, raising genuine ethical and philosophical questions about identity, agency, and what portion of a thought remains meaningfully yours once part of the loop is running on silicon. These questions remain largely theoretical for now, given how narrow current brain-computer interfaces still are, but they are a live and active area of both engineering research and bioethics. Scholarship rather than distant science fiction. None of this proves that we are close to building a genuinely conscious machine, biological or otherwise. What it does show is a real, ongoing, and quietly profound shift in how engineers think about computation itself, an acknowledgement that the deterministic, the binary architecture that has powered every computer since the mid-20th century may be extraordinarily good at certain kinds of tasks and fundamentally mismatched for others, and that closing that gap may require borrowing more directly from the messy, adaptive, noise-embracing strategies that biological evolution arrived at long before anyone designed a transistor. All of this naturally raises a forward-looking question that connects the two halves of this documentary back together. If human engineers eventually succeed in building a machine whose intelligence matches or exceeds our own, not through mimicking a specific brain, but through some architecture we have not yet invented, would we have any better chance of recognizing or understanding it than we currently have of recognizing an alien mind broadcasting from another star? Philosopher Nick Bostrom, in his 2014 book Superintelligence, formalized an idea now widely discussed among researchers studying the long-term trajectory of artificial intelligence, called the orthogonality thesis, the proposal that a system's level of intelligence and the specific goals it pursues are, in principle, independent of one another, meaning an extremely capable, superintelligent system is not automatically guaranteed to share anything resembling human values, common sense, or priorities, simply by virtue of being extremely capable. This is not a claim that such a system is imminent, nor a specific prediction about how any current technology will develop, and serious researchers disagree considerably about the timeline, likelihood, and severity of the risks involved. But it is a serious, actively debated line of inquiry within computer science and philosophy departments, connected directly to organizations including Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute, where Bostrom conducted much of this work, and it echoes, in a very concrete and immediate way, the exact question this documentary has been asking about alien cognition all along, that an intelligence organized differently enough from our own, however capable it becomes at solving problems, might reason, prioritize, and act in ways that are not simply a faster or smarter version of human thought, but something structurally foreign to it, optimized around goals and internal representations we might struggle to anticipate or even recognize as goals at all. Whether that foreign intelligence eventually arises from a research lab on Earth, running on silicon we designed ourselves, or from a biology billions of years removed from our own, evolving under the light of a different star, the underlying challenge, recognizing and understanding a genuinely alien form of cognition, may turn out to be strikingly similar either way. This brings us back to where this exploration started, but with a very different vantage point than we began with. The question of whether a machine could ever truly think the way a living creature does, or whether an intelligence built from an entirely different chemistry somewhere else in the galaxy might organize its cognition in ways we can barely conceive of, is not a question with a tidy, confirmed answer waiting to be revealed. It is one of the genuinely open frontiers where physics, neuroscience, computer science, biology, and philosophy all converge, and none of them, on their own, currently have enough evidence to settle the matter. What we do know is grounded and real. Classical computers operate on deterministic binary logic, an architecture inherited directly from Turing, von Neumann, and Shannon, fundamentally different in structure from the adaptive, noisy, densely interconnected architecture of a biological brain. Some biological processes, though a carefully limited set of them, do appear to exploit authentic quantum effects, from photosynthetic energy transfer to a bird's magnetic sense. Life on Earth has independently discovered radically different, non-neural strategies for information processing and adaptive behavior, from the decentralized arms of an octopus to the leaderless coordination of a starling moth. Consciousness itself remains scientifically unexplained at its deepest level, with serious, genuinely competing theories: global workspace theory, integrated information theory, predictive processing, and others, and no experimental consensus among the researchers who study it professionally. And after more than 60 years of dedicated searching, using tools that have grown exponentially more capable, we have not yet detected a confirmed signal or technosignature from another intelligence anywhere in the universe. A fact that is, in its own way, as strange and worth sitting with as any confirmed discovery would be. Given the tens of billions of potentially habitable worlds our best surveys now suggest exist within our galaxy alone, what remains genuinely unanswered is where all of this eventually leads. Future generations of quantum sensors, radio and optical surveys with orders of magnitude more sensitivity than what we have today. Next-generation space telescopes capable of directly imaging the atmospheres of Earth-sized exoplanets, and continued research into the physical basis of consciousness may, over the coming decades, narrow some of these questions considerably. The European Extremely Large Telescope, currently under construction in Chile's Atacama Desert, with first light expected later this decade, and proposed successor missions to the James Webb Space Telescope, now in early design phases at NASA and the European Space Agency, are being built specifically with the sensitivity needed to characterize the atmospheres of small, rocky, potentially habitable worlds in far greater detail than is currently possible, which should, within the coming decades, substantially narrow the uncertainty around several terms in Drake's original equation that have remained little more than educated guesses for over 60 years. Quantum sensing technology, meanwhile, is advancing rapidly for entirely terrestrial and commercial reasons, including navigation, medical imaging, and precision timekeeping. And some of the same sensitivity improvements driving those applications may eventually filter into astronomical instrumentation in ways not yet fully anticipated. On the neuroscience side, techniques like Massimini's perturbational complexity index, still relatively young as clinical tools, are likely to be refined and extended over the coming years, potentially offering researchers an increasingly rigorous, non-invasive way to probe questions about consciousness that were, until recently, considered purely philosophical and permanently outside the reach of experimental measurement. Whether similar tools could ever meaningfully be applied to a sufficiently sophisticated artificial system, to ask in some empirically grounded way whether anything resembling experience is present, remains an open and genuinely difficult question. One that will likely grow only more pressing as artificial systems become more sophisticated, more autonomous, and more difficult to fully interpret even by the engineers who build them. It is worth resisting the temptation, common to documentaries covering exactly this kind of territory, to force these open threads into a tidy, satisfying resolution they do not yet have. The honest position, the one every serious researcher across every field touched on here would recognize, is one of disciplined uncertainty rather than either confident dismissal or breathless speculation. We do not know whether quantum effects play any meaningful role in human consciousness beyond a small number of carefully documented biological processes elsewhere in nature. We do not know which, if any, of the competing theories of consciousness, global workspace theory, integrated information theory, predictive processing, or some framework not yet proposed, will eventually prove correct, or whether the true answer will turn out to combine elements of several. We do not know whether the silence we have encountered across more than 60 years of listening reflects the rarity of life, the rarity of intelligence, the fragility of technological civilizations, the sheer physical difficulty of interstellar communication and travel, or simply the fact that we have, so far, searched only an infinitesimally small corner of an almost incomprehensibly large galaxy, using methods calibrated to our own specific technological history rather than any universal standard. What we can say with confidence is that every one of these questions is currently being pursued through careful, methodical, testable science by researchers who have spent careers building instruments, running experiments, and following evidence rather than assuming answers in advance. That, ultimately, may be the most honest and most genuinely exciting conclusion available. not a discovered threshold separating human minds from alien ones, not a decoded signal proving we are not alone, but a widening set of tools across physics, neuroscience, computer science, and astronomy, converging steadily on some of the deepest questions anyone has ever asked about what a mind is, what it takes to build one, and whether, somewhere else in this vast and largely silent universe, something else is asking the very same questions about us. There is something worth holding on to in that uncertainty rather than rushing past it. Every generation of scientists who has taken on a piece of this puzzle, from Bull formalizing logic in the 1850s, to Turing defining computation in the 1930s, to Drake pointing a radio telescope at two quiet stars in 1960, to Fleming's team tracing the flicker of a captured photon through a bacterial protein in 2007, has done so without the comfort of a guaranteed answer waiting at the end. They built instruments, ran the numbers, published what the evidence actually showed rather than what would have made a better story, and left the next generation with sharper, better defined questions than the ones they inherited. That is, in the end, the actual shape of scientific progress on a question this large, not a single dramatic reveal, but a slow, careful narrowing of uncertainty, one honest measurement at a time, carried out by people willing to sit with not knowing for as long as it takes, trusting that the questions themselves are worth the wait, and that whatever answer eventually arrives will almost certainly look stranger and more interesting than anything imagined in advance.